In this video, I'm going to be covering the Nikon Z FC. It's this amazing looking camera that Nikon put out last year, and it looks like a film camera. In this video, I'm going to go over some camera features, some clever tips and tricks, and get you off auto mode all in one video. Most of the features I'm going to be showing you in this video can't be done in auto mode. So for the purpose of this video, let's put our camera in aperture value. On the top of the camera, you're going to see this knob. Let's switch this to A. This is a semi-programmable mode I'm going to be teaching you later. The first thing I'm going to show you is pretty easy. As you probably know by now, this camera does have a flip screen, but you can also flip it and press it into the camera so you can see on the back. For most of your photos, you're going to use the shutter button to take a picture. However, this camera is also set up with touch shutter. On the back of the screen, you're going to see this icon. When you press it, there's a bunch of options. There's one for position point, touch autofocus. When you find the option that says touch shutter, touch AF, that means wherever you press on the camera, it's going to focus and take a picture at the same time. By default, live view is turned on for this camera. It does have a sensor built in and can tell when you place the camera to your face. Then it's going to switch to viewfinder. Some people don't like using live view. There is a button here on the back of the camera that you can press. You can turn live view off and only use the viewfinder here if you want. And of course there's an option to only use live view. Normally, I just leave it to automatic switch display. Instead, there's an easier way if you just want to use the viewfinder. When you press the display button on the back of your camera, your screen will change. There's a minimalist screen. There's one with a histogram. There's also a leveler. And finally, there's just camera settings. When you use this screen, you're only going to be able to use the viewfinder. This is a very efficient way to save your battery power. And then if you want to go back to live view, just hit the display button once more and live view shows up. By the way, if you ever accidentally press a button and you see a menu that you do not want to see, instead of turning the camera on and off or panic pressing buttons, all you have to do is touch the shutter button halfway down and you'll be returned to the main screen. Most of the more popular settings on this camera are under a submenu. To access the submenu on the back of the camera, press this I button. Now this screen will show up. Let's go over a couple of these. The first option here is set picture control. Right now you're set to auto. If you hit the OK button, you're going to see more options. There's standard, neutral, vivid, that would be for flowers or fruit. And the next to that is monochrome. One of the most effective ways to improve your photography is to shoot in monochrome. When you choose this option by pressing the OK button, you will now see monochrome in your viewfinder and live view. This is a great way to optimize your lighting. And you're definitely going to improve your composition when you start shooting in monochrome mode. To this day, I'll often shoot in monochrome mode for the first 5 or 10 minutes at a location. Then I'll put my camera back to auto to get color, and then take the shots. Shooting in monochrome mode makes your pictures look more authentic. You're going to see stuff like visual weight, balance, texture, shapes, and patterns. These things add so much value to your photography, and shooting in monochrome mode is the fastest way to improve these things. The next option on here is image quality. Some photographers like to shoot in RAW, some like to shoot in JPEG. This is where you change it. So I'm going to hit the OK button and put it in RAW when I want to shoot in RAW. With this camera, I have no problem shooting in the highest quality JPEG for most of my daytime photography. So by default, I leave this option on fine. When I'm doing night photography or low light stuff, I may shoot in RAW. But when you shoot in RAW, your file sizes are 3 times larger and you're going to have an editing program to edit those files. But that's not the only reason why I don't shoot in RAW format all the time. I just find you don't really need to unless you like to do a lot of editing. So I'm going to keep my settings on fine. The next option to look at is release mode. Right now, your camera setup, when you press the shutter button, it'll take a single image. If you hit the OK button, you're going to see the different options. S means single shot. L means continuous slow. H means continuous fast. So I'm going to choose continuous fast and hit OK. Now when I press and hold my shutter button, the camera's going to fire off a whole bunch of images. This is great for action shots or when you're shooting wildlife. And when I'm done, I'm going to put it back to S for single shot. Now I'm going to press my I button again and go over to where it says AF area mode. And then I'm going to hit my OK button. The best default option here is the one that says Auto Area AF People. The camera will try to detect faces. So this is also great when you're shooting pictures with people in them. And as you can see, it does a very good job of tracking those faces too. But it also has another option that you can use while you're in this mode. If you hit the OK button, this is going to show up. Once you see this square, you can aim it on anything that you want and then hit the OK button again. Now it's going to track that subject, even if you move around or the subject moves around. And if you need to reset this, just press the OK button again and the square will appear back into the middle of the screen. And if you want to exit this completely, just press this button on the back of the camera. Now you're back to default focusing. Now let's press our I button again and go back to AF area mode. There's one more option I want to go over. Most of these you'll never use or rarely use. I'll make an entire video on the autofocus system in this camera. Let's scroll up to the area that says single point AF and choose this one by hitting the OK button. When you're here, you're going to see this red square right in the middle of your camera. Wherever you aim that square is where the camera is going to focus. This is great when you're shooting stuff with foreground matter, or if you're going to be shooting birds and trees and you don't want to have the tree branches in focus. When you're using single point focusing, your camera's only going to worry about focusing in that square and ignore everything else. And when you're done with this, press the I button and go back into the menu and put it back to Auto Area AF. The other options under the I button are stuff you'll never or rarely use as a beginner. I'll make a completely different video about these options later. So let's touch our shutter button down to go back to our main screen. You do have an articulating screen. Anything with the gray box around it on the back of the camera means that you can touch the screen to play with some of the options under here. And then when you want to get out, just touch the arrow. Now let's talk about ISO. This is where most beginners have the most problems and frustrations. Back in the film days, we used to buy our film based on the ISO standard. I like to buy 400 ISO because it was the most popular and everybody sold it. 100 ISO was the highest quality film. Digital cameras still have ISO settings. The way the Nikon FC is designed, your ISO settings are right here on the top of the camera. 100 ISO is the highest quality. It's where I leave my camera by default. But you can't shoot 100 ISO in most areas because it's too dark. You're going to need a tripod or a lighting kit. I don't like bringing tripods and lighting kits with me everywhere. By the time you get to 3200 or 6400 ISO, that's for nighttime photography. But the good news is, this camera has auto ISO. If you set your camera here on the dial to 100, we can turn on auto ISO, which means this camera is going to change the ISO without asking you. So when the camera feels like it's too dark, it's going to increase the ISO values for you. To this day, I use auto ISO on this camera for most of my photography. To change this, press the menu button. Now we're going to scroll down to the photo shooting menu. On this page, you're going to see an option that says ISO sensitivity settings. Scroll down here and then hit the OK button. Your camera should already be set to 100 on the top value. Then the second option, Auto ISO Sensitivity Control. Let's switch this to on. And once you've done that, just press the arrow on the top right corner and get out of the screen. Now most of your problems and frustrations will be gone. You can learn ISO settings later, but it'll make more sense once you've got some experience with the other settings on this camera. And this allows you to shoot in dark areas without having to bring your tripod and lighting kit. But once your ISO settings get too high, your pictures may look a little grainier. Now let's go over resetting your camera. If you ever mess something up on this camera and you can't troubleshoot it, you can reset the camera back to factory settings. It won't delete the pictures on your memory card, but it will get rid of any buttons you may have programmed or the Wi-Fi settings. To reset your camera, just press the menu button. Now we're going to scroll down to the setup menu. The second to last option is called Reset All Settings. When you choose this and then hit reset again and press OK, your camera is now reset to how it was when you bought it. Next is we're going to learn how to format our memory card. Once you've got all your pictures safely downloaded onto your computer, you're supposed to put the memory card back into the camera and format it here. To do this, hit the menu button. Go back to the setup menu, and then the very first option is Format Memory Card. Once you hit the OK button and then choose Yes, this will delete all the pictures on your card, but it's also going to optimize the memory card for this camera. You're going to have better performance and less likely to have memory card failure. So as a beginner, those are just the features you need to know now. All the other stuff you can learn later because you'll rarely use them or just use them once. Now I'm going to teach you how to get off auto mode with this camera quickly. One of the coolest advantages with this camera is that it's very easy for beginners to get off auto mode. It's only going to take you a couple hours of experience. Your gateway off of auto mode is to shoot in what's called Aperture Priority mode. And I believe we already put our cameras in Aperture mode. It's right here on your mode dial, A. When you're in Aperture mode, you're going to choose the aperture, but the camera's going to choose your shutter speed for you. And if you're using auto ISO, your camera's going to choose the ISO as well. When you shoot in what's called a wide aperture, you're opening up the iris in the lens the widest to let in the most amount of light. When you shoot in a narrow aperture, you're restricting light. So the first reason why you want to shoot in aperture mode, if you're shooting in a dark area, that could be indoors, dark cloudy days, or just in back alleys, you want to shoot in the widest aperture possible. Now that you're in aperture mode, if you spin the front command dial, you're going to see these values change. Those are called f-stops. The lower the f-stop value, the wider the aperture. This is also regulated by the lens. With the kit lens that came with this camera, the widest aperture you can go is 3.5. But your lens must be wide open. So let's open up our lens wide. Now let's spin our command dial till it says 3.5. You are now letting the most amount of light into this camera. So to get shots like these, you're pretty much shooting in a wide aperture. To get to the narrowest aperture, spin your command dial the other way. With the kit lens that came with this camera, you can set the f-stop to 22. Now you're restricting light into your camera. Your camera's going to need a longer shutter speed to get the exposure correct. But because of my style of photography, I tend to shoot in wide apertures. So I'm going to spin my camera back down to 3.5. Another reason why you shoot in aperture mode is that when you zoom in and then shoot in a wide aperture, you can create shallow depth of field. So once your lens is zoomed in all the way, you're probably going to notice that the widest aperture you can use with this lens is now 6.3. But that's still a wide aperture. Now when you focus on something close to you, and you have a background that's a few feet away or further, you can create the bokeh effect with the blurred backgrounds. You can see it right here on the camera. So find something that's about 1.5 feet, 2 feet in front of you and a background that's further away, then take a picture at 6.3. Then for the next photo, let's try f11. And finally, f22. See how all three of these pictures look different? At f22, there was almost no bokeh effect at all. At f11, it was somewhere in the middle. When you shoot 6.3, you notice the blurred backgrounds. So this is how you get the bokeh effect in aperture mode. And if you get one of those 40 or 50 millimeter prime lenses, you have an even wider aperture so you can create dreamy, smooth bokeh effect. Here's the same picture shot in aperture value of 2.8. I'll put a link to this lens in the description below in case you're interested. And finally, if you want to shoot the auto mode looking pictures, that's those flat pictures for scenery, architecture, or just family photos, I like to use f8. So let's spin our command dial and get that f-stop to f8. This is a great aperture for beginner scenery pictures. There's no more depth of field. This is what I use for most of my daytime scenery pictures. A pro would probably use f11 or f16, but they may also have a tripod. f8 pictures still look great, but it's going to have to be daylight. Even cloudy days will be fine. You're just not going to realistically use f8 indoors or when it gets really dark out. And that's going to be most of your photography is going to be one of these 3 different aperture styles. And the best part is, you're going to be good at this in just a couple of hours. When you're shooting in aperture mode, your camera's choosing the shutter speed for you, and it usually gets the right shutter speed to get the correct exposure. But it's not perfect. The good news is, this camera comes with exposure compensation. On the top right side of your camera, you're going to notice this dial. That's your exposure compensation wheel. When it's set to 0, that's a normal picture. But let's just say you want brighter pictures, or you need to darken your pictures. Just simply spin this wheel. Positive values will brighten your pictures. Negative values will darken your pictures. So for my style of photography, I like to have darker images. So I'm going to spin my wheel to -2/3. Now when I take pictures, my pictures will look a little bit darker. And the best part is, your camera has exposure simulation on the back. So when you spin the positive values, you're going to see the exposure increasing on the back of your camera. And when you spin the negative values, you're going to notice your screen will get darker to simulate what your picture will look like. When I'm shooting on a day where it's really bright sun and there's mountains, lakes, or snow, I'll often just leave my camera at -2/3. If I'm shooting on cloudy days and my pictures look too dark, I'll increase the exposure by 2/3. I rarely go past +1 or -1, so there's only about 7 values you need to know. And when you're done with exposure compensation, you have to put it back to 0. When you learn aperture mode and then you optimize your exposure with exposure compensation, you just learned mini manual mode. It's a way of getting manual mode looking pictures without actually shooting in manual mode. And it's only going to take you a couple hours before you're good at this. That's why this camera is so easy for beginners to learn with. Now aperture mode's where you're going to get your pretty pictures, your scenery, your flowers, and your portraits. But there's another semi-manual mode where you're going to get your cool looking pictures. On your mode dial, let's switch this to S. This stands for Shutter Priority mode. When you're in this mode, you're going to set the shutter speed, but your camera's going to choose the aperture for you. So it's the opposite of aperture mode. There's 3 reasons why you usually want to shoot in shutter mode. If you need a freeze action, that would be for like sporting events. You want to shoot a fast shutter speed. If you want to take a picture of a waterfall, you're going to put your camera on a tripod and then choose a slow shutter speed. And sometimes you're going to want a little bit of motion in your pictures. So you're going to choose a middle shutter speed. Now that you're in shutter mode, there's 2 ways to change the shutter speeds. On this camera, they have a little wheel here at the top with all the different shutter speeds on it. 4000 is 1/4000th of a second. This is the fastest shutter speed the camera can shoot. If you see the orange 4, that means a 4-second exposure. That's the slowest speed. So you can change the shutter speed by using this dial. All you have to do is press this button down and spin the wheel. If you prefer changing the shutter speed by using the back command dial, then set this value up here to 1/3 step. Once you've got your camera set to 1/3 step here, you can just spin your back command dial now. This is my preferred method. I just don't like the fact that you have to press this button to unlock the wheel to change the shutter speed up here. But either one of these will work just fine. So let's pretend we need a freeze action. We're going to go shoot a sporting event. Let's put our camera on the fastest shutter speed it will go. If you're using the knob, that's 4000. If you're using the command dial, just spin this command dial till it says 1/4000th of a second. When you shoot something with this fast shutter speed, you're going to freeze action. But in most cases, you're not going to be able to shoot 1/4000th of a second when you're indoors or in a very dark place. That shutter speed is too fast to let enough light into the camera. Generally speaking though, Anything shot between 1/500th of a second up to 1/4000th of a second should freeze action. So if you're in a modern hockey rink or a gymnasium, you can just spin your command dial to 1/1000th of a second. That should work just fine. If it gets any darker, try 1/500th of a second. If you're going to be taking pictures of wildlife or birds, for example, that are far away, you're going to have to shoot at fast shutter speed. It's very difficult to keep the camera still and shoot moving wildlife with a slow shutter speed. Your pictures won't look very sharp. So the further something is away from you and the faster it moves, the faster the shutter speed you're going to have to shoot with this camera. So in that case, use shutter mode instead of aperture priority mode. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of photographers make in the digital photography age is they shoot everything that moves with a fast shutter speed. When I see something moving, I'll go ahead and take some fast shutter speeds to freeze the action. But then I'm also going to try taking some middle shutter speeds to have a little bit of motion blur. These sometimes make pictures look better. It's art psychology. When you see a little bit of motion in a picture, you assume it's moving fast. For example, this car going down the highway with a fast shutter speed looks like it's parked. If we switch our camera to a middle shutter speed, in this case, 1/125th of a second. Do you see there's a little bit of motion in this car? You can change the image in most cases by changing the shutter speed. So try taking some middle shutter speed pictures as well. So let's change our camera to 1/25th of a second. It's right here on the dial on the top. Or if you're using the command dial, just spin this to 1/25th of a second. I will make some adjustments, anywhere from between 1/50th of a second up to 1/200th of a second. In these examples, you can see the difference between shooting fast and shooting middle. And finally, if you wanted to go shoot a waterfall, you're going to put your camera on a tripod and you're going to choose a 1-second exposure. If you're using the knob on the top, set this to the orange 1. That means 1 second. If you're using the command dial, just spin this till it says 1 inch. Once you're set to 1 second and then you hit the shutter button, your camera's going to take a picture for 1 full second. That's how you get these smooth waterfall pictures. You can't use 1-second exposures on a bright sunny day. It'll overexpose the image. You're going to have to do this in the shade, on cloudy days, or near the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to have to get what's called a neutral density filter and put it on your lens. But slow shutter speeds are not just for waterfalls. You can shoot up to 30 seconds if you want. I do a lot of urban dark photography with a tripod, and I do this during blue hour or after dark. I'll shoot anywhere from 1 to 30 seconds. If there's cars driving through my image, I'm going to shoot a longer shutter speed, like 15, 20, or 30 seconds. That way you can see the streaks of light going through the picture. In fact, I'm currently working on a video right now using this camera with this lens doing night photography. It should be out pretty soon. Once you learn shutter mode, and then once you learn aperture mode by themselves, the transition to full manual mode will become natural and easy one day. When you're in manual mode, you're going to be changing the shutter speed and aperture. If you do have any questions or comments about this video, please leave it in the comment section below. And thank you so much for joining me today. Good luck with your photography.